it seems to me a completely senseless move to suddenly declare martial law, and even stupider than to revoke it within hours, which makes him look, frankly, just ridiculous. He probably didn't realise that all these MPs were going to get into Parliament by hook or crook. I mean, some climbed over the fence to get in, and there were enough of them there, and they passed a motion, which was constitutional, revoking the imposition of martial law, which he then had to accept. I mean, he could have rejected that, but that would have simply upped the crisis. So he accepted it. And, within 12 hours, he's imposed it and then removed it. And it really looks like a sort of comic opera scenario.
Let's talk about the South Korean President, Yoon Suk-yeol, who declared martial law very early this morning, only to revoke it following a vote in Parliament that the president says he accepts. Suk-yeol claimed that martial law was necessary to protect the country from the threat of North Korean communist forces. That was his reasoning. Samuel Romani is an associate fellow at RUSI. He told me he thought it was a disproportionate response.
I think that there is a grave overestimation here to be talking about subversion from within, just because there's always been political disagreements in South Korea on how to deal with the North Korean question. Some have supported negotiations, as the provision of economic relief, pushing for a peaceful reintegration. I mean, obviously that camp has lost a lot of momentum just because of North Korea's activity over the past year, the abandonment of the reunification clause, their ICBM tests. But there's still an element that does want a peaceful resolution to this. Obviously, the current president is a reactionary who's much more hawkish, and he disagrees with them. But typically those disagreements were resolved through political debate and elections, and not through imposition of measures like this.
Yeah, the UK government has said it's deeply concerned by the events in Korea. I mean, it looks like it might have calmed down a little bit now, but I wonder what your reaction was when you saw this, Michael Binyon. The last time this happened was in a thoroughly different period of South Korea's democracy entirely, in 1980, I think, somewhere around then.
Yes, they had very hard-line governments then and fairly dictatorial.
1980, yeah.
But we haven't had this sort of thing for some time. We've had presidents who've been reaching out to some extent, as much as you can, to North Korea. Of course, they've always been very keen to stress their unity with America and their dependence on American security umbrella. And there are a lot of American troops in South Korea. And I think the present president, President Yoon, is very keen to try to make his mark with President Trump, worrying perhaps that Mr. Trump might think that why do we have to bother with South Korea in the future? And obviously he's been rattled by the belligerents in the north, particularly their sending of troops to Ukraine. But it seems to me a completely senseless move to suddenly declare martial law, and even stupider than to revoke it within hours, which makes him look, frankly, just ridiculous. He probably didn't realise that all these MPs were going to get into Parliament by hook or crook. I mean, some climbed over the fence to get in, and there were enough of them there, and they passed a motion, which was constitutional, revoking the imposition of martial law, which he then had to accept. I mean, he could have rejected that, but that would have simply upped the crisis. So he accepted it. And, within 12 hours, he's imposed it and then removed it. And it really looks like a sort of comic opera scenario.
A few basic questions. We know that he's unpopular. That is one of the theories behind this. But how would his popularity be set to gain from declaring martial law? I mean, why do it?
Well, that's a very good question, and I'm not sure anyone has an answer to that. He probably thought it doesn't matter if he's unpopular as long as he's got control and he can quell any potential opposition on the streets. Martial law is pretty drastic. You could even forbid people to come out in any demonstration. You could even impose a curfew. You can do all sorts of things. And he probably thought that however unpopular he was, he would remain in firm control. It certainly won't do his standing any good now, because he's made to look both weak and ever more unpopular.
OK, all right. Nels, come in on this. I mean, Michael is our big diplomatic brain here on the show, which is sort of why I'm sort of getting all the basics from him. What does this look like to you?
Well, in mere Google search of the three words South Korea democracy, the first thing that jumps up on my page, also my Google front page, says South Korea is often cited as a model of democracy due to its relatively peaceful and internally driven democratic transition process. And I've never heard of. I was born in the 80s. I don't recall in my 40-something years on this planet or so, really hearing about strife coming from the south of Korea, or there being any sort of problem there. So waking up today and hearing about martial law in South Korea also came as a huge, enormous shock. I've never visited South Korea, truth be told, or the North, of course.
I'd like to, actually. I'm
The North or
fascinated
the
by
South?
South
You'd
Korea.
like to visit? Do you like to visit the South? Or
Yeah, South.
I thought you were talking the North. I was going to say, as well, there we go. I'm sure.
Ambitious.
Times Radio would hook it up for you in a heartbeat.
I don't think I'd be let in. Have you ever been to North Korea, Michael Binyon?
No, I haven't. No, I mean, you can go in on very strictly monitored and guided tours.
Journalistic.
Yeah, you don't get to see a lot, but you know, just smelling the atmosphere, you might, the side of your eyes, you might see something. Journalists have been there, and they've been monitored and very carefully followed. You can't just sit down and file a cracking story in the middle of Pyongyang, I don't think.
Okay, Nell, sorry, carry on.
Oh, no. So, I know the key thing I wanted to say is just that, everything that's happening in South Korea right now comes as a huge surprise. I was speaking to a group of people, to a group of writers before coming on air, to ask if anyone had a head or tail of what's actually happening. And we're all pretty much in the dark. But all of us were fairly surprised at this. We've always seen South Korea as a model of peace and democracy and stability in that region, particularly in relation to their neighbors in the north. Plus also, I didn't know that another thing that wasn't clear to me was the role that North Korea plays in South Korea's politics, that the president or the head of state anyway of South Korea would eventually intervene in the actual democratic run of the state and instill martial law due to what he described as agitators or pro-Northern agitators, which I found quite really, really surprising. I'll be honest with you. I'm sorry I can't really give a bit more insight into it, but I just found it quite interesting.
Look, one kind of overriding point for me is that South Korea and its popular culture, it is a massive export for the country now. This is
K-pop,
K-pop, Korean pop. My daughter's a massive fan. I live with a lot of Korean pop in my life, but it's not just K-pop. It is the whole movement behind it. There's fashion, there's TV programs,
cars.
Yes, it is a whole culture, and South Korean kids, like to look good. They spend on clothes. They love the West as well. They have gone about trying to create a specific identity for South Korea, and that's been a huge success. And I just wonder whether the current president is in danger of ruining any of that, because he is under pressure. There's been a suggestion that an impasse over a budget might have caused some of this. So I'd just be really sort of concerned for South Korea, having done probably the best job of any country I know in terms of creating a whole culture to export. It's called is it the Haeyu culture? I'd have to Haeyu culture.
They've come a long way. When you think back, those of us who can just remember it, the Korean War, they were absolutely devastated. The whole place was laid to waste. It was a dreadful, dreadful sort of war, rather forgotten now. But they've gradually and increasingly rapidly pulled themselves up, pulled themselves forward, been extremely innovative in technology as well as in things like fashion and yes, as you say, pop culture and all sorts of things.
There's a new generation. Big,
yes, South Korean cars, big, and of course Samsung. The televisions and mobile phones and all that sort of thing. I don't think these shenanigans we're seeing in Parliament, well, rather from the presidential palace, will actually call that into question. You're not going to ruin a thriving nation just by like that. This will be dealt with. He will be sort of shunted off into history at some point. I think he's severely weakened, so whatever he tried to do is not going to happen. And Korea will carry on, I hope, being prosperous. Of course, a much longer-term threat is they're not having any children. that is the big threat to
That's very
the
true.
country. It's the country with the lowest birth rate in the world.
Yeah.
And they reckon the population will halve within a generation. It's quite serious, that.